Hello, my friend. Today I bring you another lost legend from the depths of Middle-earth. Close your eyes, feel the magic surround you. Our journey begins.
The Hobbit, who nearly destroyed the Shire. An original epic in Tolkien style, Section 1, Shadowed Beginnings. In the days when the green hills still knew peace, before darkness crept into the gardens of the little folk, there lived a halfling whose name the chroniclers dare not write. The morning wind carried more than the scent of honeysuckle and fresh earth from the burrows. It bore whispers of something ancient stirring beneath the roots of the world, and Greymantle the Wanderer felt it in his very bones as he stood upon the old mill bridge. The greenwood spread before him like a living tapestry, rolling meadows dotted with round doors, smoke curling from chimneys carved into hillsides, and orchards heavy with golden fruit. Yet the wizard's weathered eyes saw what others could not, shadows that pooled in the hollows and clung to the hedgerows like morning mist that would not lift. His staff, carved from the heartwood of the first tree, seemed to thrum with unease. "The peace of small things," he murmured to the wind, his voice carrying the weight of ages. "How fragile it proves when the deep places stir." For in the darkness beneath the whispering hills, something had awakened, something that should have remained buried with the bones of the elder days. The wizard had felt it stirring 3 nights past, a tremor in the song that bound all living things. Below in Sweetwater Village, the halflings went about their morning tasks, blissfully unaware that their world balanced on a knife's edge. They tended their gardens, smoked their pipes, and worried only about the price of seed cake and whether the barley would be ready for harvest. Among them moved one whose heart harboured secrets darker than the deepest root cellars, secrets that would soon threaten everything the little folk held dear. The very stones seemed to whisper of coming storm. Section 2, A Whisper in the Trees. 3 leagues south of Sweetwater, where the thornwood pressed close against the borders of the greenwood, the trees had begun to dream dark dreams. Silverleaf the Elven Lord felt it first, a discord in the ancient melodies that flowed through root and branch. The great oaks that had stood since the world was young now creaked with unnatural voices, and their leaves rustled with words in tongues that should have been forgotten. "Melon," came a voice soft as falling snow, and the Elf Lord turned to see Moon Whisper approaching through the twilight grove. Her starlit eyes held the same troubled gleam that had haunted his own thoughts. "You feel it too," Silverleaf said, not a question but a statement heavy with sorrow. The song grows discordant. Something stirs that was meant to sleep eternal. The she-elf nodded, her silver hair catching the last rays of sunset that filtered through the canopy. "The thornwood remembers things that were buried in the deep places, old hurts, old hungers. There is a presence here that should not be, a shadow wearing the guise of innocence." Together they walked deeper into the wood, where the paths grew strange and the very air seemed thick with memory. Here stood the Seeing Stone, a crystal of starlight and shadow that had watched over the borders since the world was young. But now its surface was clouded, showing visions that made even the deathless elves shudder. In its depths, they saw a round door of cheerful green, smoke curling from a chimney, and gardens bright with flowers. Yet beneath this peaceful scene lay something else, a hunger that gnawed at the very foundations of the earth, a will that bent all things to its purpose, and at the centre of it all, a figure small and seemingly harmless, yet whose heart beat in rhythm with darkness itself. "The halfling," Moon Whisper breathed. "But which one? The greenwood shelters thousands of the little folk." Silverleaf's ancient eyes grew grave. "That melon we must discover before the shadow spreads. For if we do not—" He let the words hang unfinished, but both knew what he meant. The peace of the greenwood, the innocence of the small folk, perhaps even the song itself, all balanced on the edge of a blade forged in darkness. The trees whispered secrets in the growing dusk, and their message was clear. Time was running short. Section 3. The Lone Rider. Dawn broke grey and cheerless over the old road, as Greymantle urged his mount forward through the morning mist. Shadowmane, his great grey horse, picked his way carefully along the ancient stones, as if he too sensed the wrongness that lay heavy upon the land. The wizard's robes, once a pristine grey like storm clouds, now seemed darker, touched by shadows that clung despite the growing light. The journey from the Greenwood had taken 3 days, though it felt like a lifetime. Behind him lay the rolling hills where the halflings dwelt in blissful ignorance, while ahead loomed the Dark Tower, a fortress of black stone that pierced the sky like a dagger thrust into the heart of the world. Grimhold, men called it, though few now remembered why it had been built or what it was meant to guard against. "Patience, old friend," Greymantle murmured to his horse as Shadowmane shied away from a cluster of withered trees. "We go where we must, not where we would." The wizard's voice carried no conviction, for he too felt the dread that emanated from the tower like heat from a forge. As the miles passed beneath them, the land grew ever more desolate. The grass here was grey and brittle, and no birds sang in the skeletal branches of dead oaks. Even the very stones of the road seemed worn by some subtle poison, their surfaces pitted and scarred as if by acid rain. This was a realm where hope came to die, where the light of stars grew dim and distant. Yet Greymantle pressed on, for he alone among the wise had begun to piece together the signs. The stirring in the deep places, the discord in the song, the shadows that gathered where no shadows should be, all pointed to one terrible truth. Something that had slumbered since the world was young was waking, and its awakening would bring ruin to all the fair things of the earth. The Dark Tower grew larger with each passing hour, its black spire seeming to drink the very light from the sky. At its base the wizard could see the ruins of the old city, Grimstad, where once the kings of men had ruled with wisdom and might. Now only broken walls remained, and among them moved shapes that might once have been human but were human no longer. As the sun reached its zenith, casting short, sharp shadows on the desolate ground, Greymantle finally halted his horse at the edge of the dead lands. Before him stretched a wasteland of ash and bone, and in its centre rose the tower, black against the grey sky like a wound in the world itself. "Here then," he said to the wind, "lies the source of the shadow. Here the truth waits to be uncovered." And with a heavy heart he urged Shadowmane forward into the darkness. Section 4. Grimhold in the Distance. The cursed fortress reared before Greymantle like a monument to despair, its black stones seeming to devour the very light that touched them. Grimhold, once called Starwatch in the days when its towers gleamed white as bone beneath the moon, now brooded over the wasteland like a cancer upon the earth. The wizard sat motionless upon Shadowmane's back, studying the ancient stronghold with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of kingdoms. From this distance, perhaps a league from the tower's base, he could see the full scope of the ruin that had befallen this once fair realm. The outer walls, built in the days of the High Kings, lay broken in great sections, their white marble stained black with some corruption that seemed to seep from the very stones. Where once gardens had bloomed with flowers that sang in harmony with the wind, now only twisted thorns grew, their barbs gleaming like obsidian in the pale light. The moat that had once run bright and clear with water from the crystal springs was now a stagnant pool of shadow, its surface unmarked by ripple or reflection. Nothing lived in those dark waters, no fish swam in their depths, no insects skittered across their surface. It was as if life itself recoiled from whatever evil had taken root in this place. What manner of darkness could work such ruin, the wizard whispered, though he feared he already knew the answer, for the corruption that radiated from Grimhold was not born of war or conquest, but of something far more subtle and far more dangerous, the slow rot that comes when good turns to evil from within. Above the broken ramparts, carrion birds wheeled in endless circles, their harsh cries the only sound to break the deathly silence. These were not the clean ravens of the high mountains, but twisted things with feathers black as midnight and eyes like burning coals. They had fed well on the corruption of this place, growing fat and foul on the despair that rose from the tower like smoke. As Greymantle watched a shape emerge from one of the tower's high windows, a figure cloaked in darkness that seemed to drink the light from around it. Even at this distance, the wizard could feel the malice that radiated from that distant form, a cold hatred that made his ancient bones ache with remembered pain. This was no mere sorcerer or fallen lord, but something far older and far more terrible. The wind that blew from the tower carried with it the scent of decay and the whisper of voices that spoke in tongues long forgotten. They told of bargains made in darkness, of power purchased at a price too terrible to name, and of a halfling whose innocent heart had become a vessel for ancient evil. With a shudder that ran through his entire being, Greymantle turned Shadowmane away from that accursed sight. He had seen enough to confirm his worst fears. The shadow that threatened the Greenwood was not some distant evil stirring in far lands, but a corruption that had taken root in the most unlikely of places, in the heart of one of the little folk themselves. Section 5. Into the black night fell like a shroud as Greymantle approached the outer ruins of Grimstad, the dead city that crouched at Grimhold's feet like a faithful hound. Shadowman picked his way through the rubble with infinite care, for the very stones seemed to hunger for the touch of living flesh. Here and there pale lights flickered in the ruins, not the warm glow of hearth fires, but cold flames that gave no heat and cast shadows that moved of their own accord. The wizard dismounted at the edge of what had once been the city's great square, where in bygone days merchants had traded in silk and silver, while children played among the fountains. Now only broken stones remained, and the fountains ran with water black as ink. He whispered words of warding over his faithful horse, binding him with spells that would keep him safe until morning, or until morning never came again. "Wait here, old friend," he murmured, stroking Shadowmane's neck. "If I do not return by dawn, carry word to the Elven Lords. They must know what darkness stirs in this place." Alone now, Greymantle made his way through the ruins, his staff the only light in a world consumed by shadow. The ancient stones seemed to whisper as he passed, telling tales of the city's last days, of how the corruption had come not with fire and sword, but with promises of power whispered in dreams. The people of Grimstad had not been conquered. They had been seduced, drawn one by one into darkness until nothing remained but empty shells that walked and talked but were no longer truly alive. The tower's entrance yawned before him like a mouthful of broken teeth. The great doors that had once been carved with images of stars and flowers now bore different symbols, sigils that hurt to look upon directly, runes that spoke of binding and domination, and the slow feast of souls. Greymantle paused at the threshold, gathering his strength for what lay ahead. As he stepped across into the darkness beyond, the very air seemed to thicken around him, pressing against his lungs like liquid shadow. The walls were carved with murals that moved and writhed when glimpsed from the corner of the eye, depicting scenes of such horror that even his ancient mind recoiled from their full meaning. This was a place where reality grew thin, where the boundaries between the world of the living and the realm of nightmare had been worn away by centuries of corruption. Deeper he climbed, following stairs that spiraled upward into the heart of the tower. With each step, the darkness seemed to press closer, and strange voices echoed in the empty chambers, the voices of the lost crying out warnings that came too late. They spoke of a bargain made in innocence, of power offered freely to one who seemed too small and harmless to matter. At last, he reached a chamber high in the tower's crown, where pale light filtered through windows of black crystal, and there, in the centre of the room, he saw that which made his blood run cold, a seeing stone of purest shadow, and reflected in its depths the peaceful gardens of the Greenwood and the round door of a hobbit hole where evil wore the mask of innocence. Section 6. The Captive King. In the deepest vaults of Grimhold, beneath even the foundations of the ancient tower, lay chambers that had been old when the world was young. Here, where the very roots of the earth ran black with corruption, Greymantle found what he had come seeking, and what he had prayed he would not find. The dungeon was carved from living rock, its walls weeping with moisture that glowed with a sickly phosphorescence. Iron chains hung from the ceiling, and in their embrace was suspended a figure that had once been mighty beyond measure. Now the High King of Valinor hung in those bonds like a broken bird, his silver hair turned grey with suffering, his once bright eyes dim with the weight of terrible knowledge. "Ah," came a voice like wind through autumn leaves, "the grey wanderer arrives at last. I wondered when the wise would finally see the truth." King Thengel lifted his head with effort, and in his gaze Greymantle saw both recognition and pity. "You have felt it, have you not? The corruption that spreads from the most innocent of sources." The wizard approached the chained king with reverence, for Thengel had once been counted among the greatest of the Children of Light. His realm of Valinor had been a beacon of hope in dark times, a place where wisdom and beauty had flourished like flowers after rain. That such a one should be brought low spoke of evil beyond measure. "How long have you been prisoner here?" Greymantle asked, though he feared the answer. "Time has little meaning in this place," Thengel replied, his voice hollow with despair. "I have watched seasons turn to years, and years to decades. I came here following the same trail that brought you. The whispers in the dark, the corruption spreading through the green lands. But I came too late, wizard. The deed was already done." The king's eyes grew distant, as if seeing visions too terrible to bear. He seemed so harmless, you understand. A simple halfling with a love for gardens and good food and the simple pleasures of life. When the darkness first whispered to him, he thought it was merely suggesting ways to make his crops grow better, his harvests more abundant. Such small things, such innocent desires. Greymantle felt his heart grow heavy as stone. And the corruption spread from there? Like ripples in a pond, Thengel confirmed. Each act of seemingly innocent magic made him hungrier for more. The darkness fed him just enough power to make him feel wise, just enough success to make him feel chosen, and all the while it was preparing him to be its vessel in the world of the living. The chained king raised his head, and in his eyes burned a flame that even captivity could not quench. "Listen well, Grey Wanderer, for I have learned truths that may yet save your precious greenwood. The halfling is not evil by choice, but by corruption. Deep within him, the innocent heart still beats, but it is buried beneath layers of shadow so thick that even he no longer remembers who he once was." "Then there is hope?" Greymantle asked, though he hardly dared believe it. "There is always hope," Thengel replied, "but it comes at a price. To save the halfling, someone must be willing to descend into the very depths of shadow and remind him of the light he once knew. Someone must love him enough to risk their own soul for his redemption." In the distance, something howled, a sound of such anguish that even the stones seemed to weep. The darkness was stirring, and time was running short. Section 7. The Shadow's Voice. In the highest chamber of Grimhold, where the walls were carved with symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering torchlight, Greymantle came at last face to face with the source of the corruption. The necromancer's presence filled the room like smoke, a darkness so profound it seemed to have weight and substance. Though no physical form could be seen, the wizard felt eyes upon him, ancient, malevolent, and utterly without mercy. "So," came a voice like grinding stone, like the whisper of wind through graveyards, "the meddling fool arrives at last. I have watched you, Grey Wanderer, as you stumbled through the ruins of my domain. Did you truly think you could oppose me?" The darkness seemed to coalesce, taking shape without substance, a shadow that spoke with the authority of eons. This was no mere sorcerer or fallen lord, but something far older, a remnant of the first darkness that had existed before the world was sung into being. It had slumbered for ages beyond count, waiting for the right vessel, the right opportunity to return to power. "I know what you are," Greymantle said, his voice steady, despite the terror that clawed at his heart. "You are the unnamed, the shadow that was cast out in the first days, but even you cannot corrupt one of the halflings without their consent, however unwilling." Laughter like breaking glass filled the chamber. "Consent? Oh, but I had his consent, wizard, given freely, gladly even. Do you know what I offered him? Not power, not glory, not the conquest of kingdoms. I offered him the one thing his innocent heart desired above all else, the ability to make his gardens grow." The shadow swirled, and within its depths, Greymantle saw visions of the halfling as he had once been. Young, eager, with dirt under his fingernails and joy in his eyes as he tended his plots. But even then, there had been a hunger in him, a desire for perfection that went beyond the natural order of things. He wanted his tomatoes to be the largest, his flowers the most beautiful, his crop yields the most abundant in all the green ward. Such small ambitions, you might think. But pride, wizard, pride is the crack through which the greatest darkness can enter. I simply helped him achieve his dreams. The vision shifted, showing the halfling's gradual transformation. Each success made him hungrier for more. Each triumph over nature's laws made him bolder in his demands. The darkness had fed him power in measured doses, always careful to make him feel that he was the one in control, that he was using the shadow rather than being used by it. by the time he understood what he had become, the necromancer continued, it was far too late. The corruption had taken root not just in his garden, but in his very soul, and through him it began to spread to others. The innocent halflings of the Greenwood, drawn to his success, began to follow his methods. Soon, the entire realm will be mine. Greymantle raised his staff, and white light blazed forth, driving the shadows back. Not while I draw breath, creature of darkness. The halflings are under my protection. Are they? Came the mocking reply. Look closer, fool. See what your precious innocence has wrought. And in the light of the wizard's staff, new visions appeared. Visions of the Greenwood itself, where the corruption had indeed begun to spread. Gardens too perfect, crops too abundant, and in the eyes of the halflings, a hunger that had not been there before. Section 8. Fire in the Darkness. The battle that followed shook the very foundations of Grimhold, a clash between light and shadow that had been building since the world began. Greymantle stood in the centre of the chamber like a pillar of fire, his staff blazing with power drawn from the heart of creation itself. Against him, the necromancer's darkness pressed from all sides, seeking to snuff out the light that dared defy the ancient shadow. You cannot win, wizard, the voice of darkness howled as waves of malice crashed against Greymantle's defences. I am eternal. I am the void that existed before the first. Star sang. What are you but a flickering candle against the night? But Greymantle stood firm, drawing strength not from his own power alone, but from the memory of all the small good things he had sworn to protect. He thought of halfling children playing in summer meadows, of warm hearth fires and shared meals, of the simple joy that came from watching seeds grow into flowers. These things, not magic or might, were his true strength. You are wrong, he said, his voice carrying across the chaos of their battle. You're not eternal, you're merely old, and age without wisdom is nothing but accumulated folly. You've forgotten the most important truth of all, that even the smallest light can drive away the greatest darkness. White fire erupted from his staff, and for a moment the shadow was driven back. In that brief respite, Greymantle saw deeper into the heart of the necromancer's power, and what he saw there gave him both hope and despair. For at the centre of the darkness, like a candle flame trapped in black crystal, was the innocent soul of the halfling, not destroyed, but buried beneath layers of corruption. The shadow rallied, pressing its attack with renewed fury. The walls of the chamber began to crack under the strain, and far below the entire tower groaned like a living thing in pain. Debris rained down from the ceiling, and the air itself seemed to burn with the intensity of their conflict. Behold the price of your defiance, the necromancer shrieked, and suddenly the chamber filled with visions of what would come to pass if the wizard fell. The Greenwood consumed by shadow, its gentle folk twisted into servants of darkness. The corruption spreading beyond the halfling lands to consume all the free peoples of the world. Cities falling not to sword and flame, but to the slow rot of evil wearing the mask of good. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Greymantle heard another voice, faint and far away, but unmistakably pure. It was the halfling himself calling out from within his prison of shadow, begging for someone, anyone, to remember who he had once been. In that moment, the wizard understood what must be done. With a cry that shattered the very stones of Grimhold, Greymantle hurled not his power, but his compassion into the heart of the darkness. Love, not might, was the weapon that could pierce the shadow's armour. The necromancer's scream of rage and pain echoed across the wastelands as his perfect corruption was tainted by the one thing he could not understand or control, forgiveness freely given. The darkness did not die, for such ancient evil cannot be so easily destroyed, but it was wounded, driven back to the deep places to nurse its hurts and plot new revenge. And in the sudden silence that followed, Greymantle heard the sound he had hoped for, the voice of an innocent halfling, confused and frightened, but alive and free. Section 9. Return to the Wise. The Council of the Wise gathered in the crystal halls of Rivendell on the Water as autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson. 3 days had passed since Greymantle's return from the Cursed Tower. 3 days of urgent messages carried by swift-flying eagles to all the corners of the world where wisdom still held sway. Now they sat in circle, elves whose memories reached back to the dawn of days, men whose kingdoms stood as bastions against the dark, and the dwarves whose axes had carved out realms of light beneath the mountains. Lord Silverleaf spoke first, his melodious voice heavy with concern. The grey wanderer brings tidings that darken the very air. If what he has discovered is true, then the corruption that threatens the greenwood is but a small part of a greater evil. "Tell us again," rumbled Ironbeard the Dwarf Lord, his great axe gleaming in the starlight that streamed through the crystal dome above them. "Tell us of this halfling who has become a vessel for the ancient darkness." Greymantle rose from his seat, the weight of his discovery bowing his shoulders like years beyond counting. His name was Bramble Greenhill, and he was the most innocent of his kind, a gardener who loved the earth and growing things above all else. But innocence, I fear, is no shield against corruption when pride opens the door. He spoke of his journey to Grimhold, of the chained king and the necromancer's boasts, of the slow seduction of a simple halfling's heart. As he talked, the faces around the circle grew ever more grave, for they understood the implications of what he described. "If the shadow can corrupt even the halflings," murmured Lady Moonwhisper, "then nowhere is safe. They are the most innocent of all the free peoples, the least touched by the hunger for power that makes other hearts vulnerable." "Yet perhaps that very innocence was his downfall," said King Aldrich of the Northern Marches, his scarred face grim in the starlight. "The halfling could not conceive of evil great enough to use his simple desires for its own ends. He trusted because he had never learned to doubt." Greymantle nodded sadly. The necromancer spoke truly when he said that the corruption has begun to spread. Other halflings, seeing Bramble's success, have begun to follow his methods. They know not that they court their own damnation with each step down that dark path. A heavy silence fell over the council. They had faced many perils in their long years, armies of orcs, dragons wakening in their lairs, the machinations of dark lords in their towers of iron and shadow. But this was different. This was corruption that wore the face of good, evil that advanced not through conquest, but through seduction. "What hope remains?" asked Prince Starweaver, youngest of the elven lords. "Can the halfling be saved, or must we act to prevent the spread of his influence?" The question hung in the air like a blade. All present understood what he meant, though none wished to voice it aloud. If Bramble Greenhill could not be redeemed, then perhaps the only way to save the Greenwood was to ensure that his corrupting influence spread no further. But Greymantle straightened, and in his eyes burned a fire that had not dimmed despite all he had seen. "There is hope still. The innocent heart beats yet within the halfling's breast, buried but not destroyed. King Thengel believed it could be reached, and I share his faith. But the task will require great sacrifice from one willing to risk their very soul for another's redemption." The wizard's gaze swept the circle, and one by one the wise ones nodded their understanding. The real battle was only beginning. Section 10. Stirring the north winter winds howled across the lonely mountain as Greymantle made his way through the great halls of the dwarf kingdom. The ancient passages, carved from living stone by hands that had been dust for 1,000 years, echoed with the ring of hammers and the songs of the smiths. Here at least the old ways endured unchanged, and the darkness that crept through other realms had found no purchase among the children of stone and iron. King Thorin Ironforge received the wizard in the Hall of Kings, where the thrones of all the dwarf lords were carved from a single mighty stalagmite that rose from the mountain's heart. The dwarf king was ancient even by the standards of his long-lived people, his beard white as winter snow, but his eyes still bright with the fire of the forges. "Welcome, Greymantle the Grey," Thorin rumbled, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "Your message spoke of urgent need. What aid do the wise require of the mountain kingdom?" The wizard bowed deeply, for he honoured the strength that dwelt in deep places, the steadfast courage that no darkness could shake. "I come seeking not armies, Lord King, but something far more precious. Hope. The corruption that spreads from the Greenwood threatens all the free peoples, but it cannot be fought with sword and axe alone." He told the dwarf king of his discoveries, of the halfling seduced by ancient evil, of the spreading shadow that wore the mask of innocence. As he spoke, the assembled dwarf lords muttered among themselves, their faces growing dark with anger and concern. "Bah!" spat Balin Ironfist, mightiest of the dwarf warriors. "This necromancer thinks to corrupt the small folk, does he? Let him try such tricks among the mountains. My axe has tasted the blood of shadows before." But King Thorin raised his hand for silence, and his eyes were thoughtful. This is no enemy that can be faced in open battle, my friends. Tell me, wizard, what is it you truly seek from us?" Greymantle smiled grimly. "Wisdom, Lord King. Your people have dwelt in the deep places since the world was young. You have seen the rise and fall of kingdoms, the ebb and flow of darkness and light. In all your long memory, have you ever heard tell of one who was corrupted yet redeemed, who fell to shadow yet found their way back to the light?" The Dwarf King stroked his beard, his eyes distant with memory. "Aye," he said at length. "There was one, in the elder days. Dane the Gold Seeker, who was seduced by the dragon fire that burns in the deep treasuries. He became a creature of greed and malice, caring for nothing but the gleam of precious metal. Yet in the end, love called him back, the love of his son, who risked all to reach the good that still lived in his father's heart." "And how was this redemption achieved?" Greymantle asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Through sacrifice," Thorin replied solemnly. "Dane's son, young Nain, descended into the treasury where his father had become more dragon than dwarf. He offered himself as ransom for his father's soul, and when Dane saw what his corruption had driven his beloved child to do, the spell was broken." The wizard nodded slowly. "Then you understand what must be done. The halfling Bramble still lives within the shadow that has consumed him. But to reach him, someone must be willing to risk everything, to descend into darkness with nothing but love as their shield." King Thorin's eyes were grave. "A dangerous path, wizard, and not one that can be walked by the wise or the mighty. Sometimes the greatest deeds are done by the smallest hands." Far above them, in the high places where the wind sang through stone, an eagle cried. The sound carried across the vast distances to where other kingdoms waited for word, to where other councils debated what must be done. The pieces were moving, the players taking their places for a game whose stakes were nothing less than the soul of innocence itself. In the Greenwood, the corruption continued to spread, but hope had not yet died. Section 11. A Garden Remembered. In the rolling hills of the Greenwood, where the river Sweetwater wound its lazy way between meadows bright with wildflowers, there stood a hobbit hole unlike any other. From the outside it seemed ordinary enough, a round green door set into a grassy hillside, windows gleaming like friendly eyes, and a garden that bloomed with impossible beauty even as winter's grip tightened on the land. But those who looked closer might have noticed that the flowers bloomed too brightly, the vegetables grew too large, and the very grass seemed to whisper secrets in languages that no honest earth should know. This was Bramble Cottage, home to Bramble Greenhill, though the halfling who dwelt within bore little resemblance to the innocent gardener he had once been. Greymantle stood at the garden gate as dawn broke over the greenwood, his grey robes stirring in a wind that carried the scent of roses and something darker underneath. 3 months had passed since his return from the Council of the Wise, 3 months of careful planning and painful preparation for what must now be attempted. The garden before him was a study in corrupted beauty. Roses the size of dinner plates bloomed in colours that had no names, their thorns gleaming like obsidian blades. Tomato vines, heavy with fruit that glowed with their own inner light, twisted up stakes carved with symbols that hurt to look upon directly. And in the centre of it all grew a tree that should not have existed. An apple tree whose golden fruit hung heavy and tempting, though any who looked upon it felt a hunger that gnawed at more than the belly. "Beautiful, isn't it?" came a voice from the cottage door, and Greymantle turned to see the halfling who had once been Bramble Greenhill. He was taller than he should have been, his once soft features grown sharp and angular. His eyes, which had once sparkled with simple joy, now held depths that seemed to go down forever, and in those depths, something ancient and hungry stirred. Yet beneath the changes, Greymantle could still see traces of the gardener he had once been. The careful way he closed the door behind him, the gentle touch with which he brushed past his plants, the pride that lit his features as he surveyed his impossible garden. The innocent heart still beat, buried beneath layers of corruption like a seed beneath winter snow. "I've been expecting you," Bramble continued, his voice carrying harmonics that no halfling throat should have been able to produce. "The shadow told me you would come, the meddling wizard who thinks he can undo what has been so beautifully accomplished." "I come not to undo," Greymantle replied carefully, "but to remember. Do you recall, Bramble, how this garden began? Do you remember the first seeds you planted in ordinary soil, with nothing but your own hands and your love for growing things?" For just a moment, something flickered in the halfling's strange eyes. A flash of memory, of loss, of terrible understanding. But then the shadow reasserted itself, and Bramble's face hardened like stone. "Seeds?" he laughed, and the sound was like wind through a graveyard. "What need have I for seeds when I can call forth life from the very void? Watch, wizard, and see what real mastery looks like." He gestured toward a bare patch of earth, and immediately vines burst forth. But these were not the honest plants that Bramble had once tended. They grew with unnatural speed, their leaves black as midnight, their flowers opening to reveal centres that gleamed like eyes. This was not cultivation but corruption, not growth but grotesque parody of life itself. Yet Greymantle saw deeper, and what he saw broke his ancient heart. For in the halfling's movements, in the careful way he tended even these abominations, he could see the ghost of the gardener Bramble had once been, a creature who had loved the earth with such pure devotion that even corruption could not entirely erase that love. "I remember," the wizard said softly, "a young halfling who spent hours talking to his plants, who believed that words of kindness could make flowers bloom brighter. I remember how he would save the tiniest seeds, nurturing them, through the hardest winters because he could not bear to see potential life wasted." The vines wavered, their growth stuttering as something deep within Bramble stirred. "Stop," he whispered, but his voice carried uncertainty now. "That halfling was weak. I have become so much more." "Have you?" Greymantle asked, stepping closer to the garden gate. "Or have you become so much less? Tell me, Bramble, when did you last feel joy at the simple sight of a seedling breaking through the soil? When did you last know the honest tiredness that comes from a day's work in good earth under the honest sun?" The halfling's hands began to shake, and for a moment, the impossible perfection of his garden flickered like a candle flame in the wind. Section 12. The plan set in motion. Far beneath the misty mountains, in halls where firelight danced on walls of precious stone, the dwarf lords gathered around their ancient maps. King Thorin spread before them charts drawn on vellum made from dragonhide, their surfaces marked with runes that glowed softly in the forge light. These were not merely maps of stone and tunnel, but diagrams of something far more complex, the paths that power takes as it flows through the deep places of the world. "Here," Thorin said, his thick finger tracing a line of silver fire that ran from the heart of the mountain to distant lands, "runs the song line that connects all living things, and here," his finger moved to where the line bent and twisted like a wounded snake, "is where the corruption has taken root." Greymantle studied the map with eyes that had learned to read the deep mysteries during his long years of wandering. What he saw there confirmed his worst fears and his greatest hopes in equal measure. The halfling's corruption was not contained to his garden alone, but had begun to spread along the songlines themselves, following the paths of power that connected all growing things. "The shadow seeks to turn the very roots of creation to its purpose," he murmured. "If it succeeds, every seed planted, every flower that blooms, every tree that grows will serve its will. The earth itself will become its ally." "But look closer," rumbled Balin Iron Fist, pointing to a cluster of symbols near the centre of the map. "See how the corruption spirals inward, always returning to its source. The halfling may be the vessel, but he is also the key. Cut the root, and the poison dies." "Or save the root," Greymantle countered, "and the poison becomes medicine. The same power that now spreads corruption could be turned to healing, if only the halfling's heart can be reached." King Thorin nodded slowly. "Then we are decided. The ancient ways speak of the ritual of remembered joy, a magic older than kingdoms, older than the first forges, but it requires components that cannot be gathered by dwarf or elf or man." He opened a smaller scroll, its surface covered with delicate script in the old tongue. "A flower that bloomed before the shadow touched it. Earth that knew the halfling's touch before corruption claimed his hands, and water from the spring where he first learned to love growing things." Greymantle's eyes widened as he read the ancient words. These things exist only in memory now. The shadow has tainted everything the halfling ever touched. "Not everything," came a new voice from the doorway, and the assembled lords turned to see a figure they had not expected. A hobbit barely come of age, with dirt under his fingernails and tears on his cheeks. "Not everything," repeated Pip Brownhill, cousin to the corrupted gardener. "I know where Uncle Bramble kept his seed box, the one he made before he changed. And I remember the old well, the one he used to draw water from when he was teaching me to tend the radishes. The young hobbit stepped forward, his small hands clenched into fists of determination. He was good once. He taught me that every seed holds a promise, that every plant has a song if you know how to listen. If there's a chance to bring that back, then I'll help, no matter the danger. Greymantle knelt before the brave little hobbit, seeing in him an echo of what Bramble had once been. The path will be perilous, young master. The shadow will not give up its prize easily. I know, Pip replied, his voice steady despite his tears. But he's family, and in the Greenwood, we don't abandon family, not even when they're lost in darkness. The wizard smiled, and for the first time in months, hope kindled bright in his ancient heart. Section 13, The Fire Awakens. In the depths of the withered wood, where the great dragon Smaug the Terrible had made his lair among the bones of ancient kings, a sound echoed that had not been heard for centuries, the deep rumbling growl of a worm stirring from slumber. The dragon's golden eyes opened like twin suns in the darkness, and the temperature in the vast cavern rose until the very stones began to weep. Smaug had felt it, a disturbance in the song that bound all things, a corruption so profound that even his cold reptilian heart was touched by unease. For dragons, mighty though they were still creatures of the earth, children of the ancient music that had shaped the world. And when that music grew discordant, when the very roots of creation were threatened, even the greediest worm could not ignore the danger. The dragon raised his mighty head, emeralds and rubies cascading from his scales like a waterfall of fire. Around him lay the treasures of a dozen kingdoms, crowns of forgotten kings, swords that had turned the tide of ancient battles, rings of power whose like would never be forged again. But for once Smaug's thoughts were not on his hoard. Something stirs, he rumbled, his voice shaking dust from the cavern ceiling. Something that should not be. The little folk, one of them reeks of shadow older than my own ancient bones. With movements that belied his enormous size, the dragon flowed through the tunnels that led to the world above. He emerged from the mountain's heart just as the sun was setting, his scales catching the dying light like a living constellation. Below him spread the lands of men and elves, forests and rivers and fields golden with grain, all of it now touched by the spreading stain of corruption. Smaug's keen eyes could see what others could not, the way the songlines writhed and twisted where the halfling's influence touched them, the unnatural glow that emanated from the greenwood like a festering wound upon the world. And in that glow, he sensed something that filled even his dragon heart with dread. The necromancer, he hissed, recognizing the ancient malice that had once threatened to consume all things. I thought that shadow vanquished, cast into the void beyond the walls of night, yet it stirs again, wearing innocence as its mask. The dragon spread his wings, each one broad enough to shadow a small town, and took to the skies. For all his greed and cruelty, Smaug was no fool. He understood that if the corruption spread unchecked, there would be no world left to hoard treasure in, no kingdoms left to terrorize. The shadow would consume all things, including dragons. As he flew through the night air, his passage marked by the terror of all who saw his shape blot out the stars, Smaug's thoughts turned to the ancient pacts, the old alliances that bound even dragons to the preservation of the world. There were debts older than memory, oaths sworn in the first days when the earth was young. Perhaps it was time to remember what it meant to serve something greater than mere avarice. Perhaps even a dragon could choose the light when the darkness threatened to devour everything that gave meaning to existence. Below him, in a garden that bloomed with impossible beauty, a corrupted halfling tended plants that whispered secrets in the language of shadow. But the dragon's keen eyes saw deeper, and what they saw there filled him with something he had not felt in centuries: pity. For in the end they were not so different, the dragon and the halfling. Both had been seduced by promises of power, both had allowed their hearts to be corrupted by desires that seemed innocent at first. The difference was that Smaug had chosen his path with full knowledge of what he was becoming. The halfling had been deceived. Section 14, A Blade. Not yet drawn. In the armories beneath the White City, where the greatest smiths of the age had laboured since the world was young, there hung a sword that had never known battle. Flame Tongue, it was called. forged in the days when the necromancer first stirred, when the wise had feared that conventional weapons might prove useless against the corruption that wore virtue's mask. The blade was beautiful beyond description, its steel gleaming like captured starlight, its edge keen enough to cut shadow itself, its hilt wrapped in wire spun from the first gold ever drawn from the earth's heart. Runes ran along its fuller, words in the ancient tongue that spoke of binding and release, of love that conquered darkness, of sacrifice that redeemed the lost. But for all its beauty, for all the power that thrummed through its metal like a heartbeat, Flametongue had remained untested. The evil it had been forged to face had retreated to the deep places, and the sword had hung forgotten as ages passed and the memory of its purpose dimmed. Now, as corruption spread from the greenwood like ripples in a poisoned pond, the blade began to sing. Lord Marshal Andreth stood before the weapon, his weathered hands trembling as he reached toward the hilt. He was old now, grey of beard and bent with years, but he remembered the day Flametongue had been completed, remembered the hope and fear that had gone into its making. 40 years I have served as keeper of this blade, he whispered to the empty armoury. 40 years I have prayed that it would never be needed, yet perhaps that prayer was folly. The sword came free from its mounting with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The moment Andreth's fingers closed around the grip, visions flooded his mind. Images of the battle to come, of the choice that would define the fate of all free peoples. He saw a garden where impossible flowers bloomed in toxic splendour, saw a halfling whose innocent eyes had been replaced by windows into ancient darkness. He saw the corruption spreading like plague through the green lands, turning friend against friend, parent against child, until nothing remained but hollow shells serving the shadow's will. But he also saw hope, small and fragile as a candle flame, but burning still in the depths of a corrupted heart. He saw love that refused to surrender, friendship that endured beyond death, and the power of choice that remained even in the darkest hour. "The blade knows," came a voice from the doorway, and Andreth turned to see Greymantle standing there, his grey robes travel-stained, and his face grave with purpose. It was forged for this day, for this choice, not to destroy the halfling, but to free him. The old marshal nodded slowly. "I feel its purpose thrumming through the steel. But wizard, I am too old for such battles. My sword arm is no longer strong, and my heart is heavy with the weight of years." Greymantle stepped forward, his eyes kind but filled with an urgency that brooked no delay. "Then perhaps it is time to pass the blade to younger hands. The corruption grows stronger with each passing day. Soon it will be beyond any power to heal." Together they looked upon Flametongue, and both men felt the weight of destiny settling upon their shoulders. Somewhere in the greenwood, a corrupted halfling tended his impossible garden, unaware that hope approached with measured steps. The final gambit was about to begin, and everything, the fate of the halflings, the future of the free, peoples, perhaps the very song that held the world together, hung in the balance. The blade sang louder now, its voice a harmony of steel and starlight, of love and loss and the promise of redemption. Soon it would taste shadow, and in that tasting determine whether innocence could be reclaimed from the depths of corruption. The hour of choice was at hand. Section 15. The Garden's Last Stand. Dawn broke grey and cheerless over Bramble Cottage as the final confrontation began. Greymantle stood at the garden gate, no longer alone. Beside him walked young Pip Brownhill, clutching a small wooden box that held treasures beyond price, seeds from before the corruption, soil that remembered honest growth, and water drawn from the spring where a young halfling had first learned to love the earth. Behind them came others, Lord Silverleaf, with starlight gleaming in his ancient eyes, King Thorin bearing a hammer that sang with power, and Lord Marshal Andreth carrying Flametongue in a sheath that seemed to drink the very light. But most unexpected of all was the great shadow that fell across them, as Smaug the dragon settled onto the hillside, his golden eyes fixed on the impossible garden with something that might have been regret. "So," came Bramble's voice from among his twisted plants, "the wise come in force to face one small gardener. I am honoured." But the halfling who stood before them bore little resemblance to the simple folk of the greenwood. He had grown tall and angular, his features sharp as broken glass, his eyes deep pools of shadow, that seemed to hold all the darkness of the world. Around him, his garden writhed with unnatural life. Roses with thorns like daggers, fruit trees bearing poison apples, and flowers that whispered secrets in dead languages. "We come not as enemies," Greymantle said gently, "but as friends who remember what you once were. Look, Bramble." He gestured to young Pip, who stepped forward with the seed box clutched to his chest. "Your cousin remembers. He has brought you gifts from the time before darkness touched your heart." For a moment, Bramble's facade wavered. His strange eyes fixed on the wooden box, and something flickered across his features. Memory, perhaps, or longing for something lost. "That old thing," he whispered. I remember making it myself, carving each letter with my own hands. BRAMBLE in simple block letters, painted green like growing things." "Yes," Pip said, tears streaming down his young face. "You made it for me, Uncle, when I was just a fauntling learning to tend radishes. You said every gardener needs a special place to keep their most precious seeds." The corrupted halfling staggered as if struck a physical blow. Around him, his impossible garden shuddered, the unnatural plants swaying as if in a wind that no one else could feel. "No," he gasped, pressing his hands to his temples. "That weakness is gone. I am strong now. Master of growing things, Lord. Lord of nothing," Smaug rumbled, his great voice rolling across the hillside like thunder. "I know corruption when I see it, little gardener. I have worn it like a cloak for centuries, and I tell you truly, you are no master, but a slave. The shadow uses you as a puppet uses a string." Bramble's eyes blazed with fury, and he raised his hands, calling forth vines thick as tree trunks, their surfaces covered in thorns that gleamed like black ice. They lashed out at the assembled company, but Lord Silverleaf's sword sang as it cut through them, and King Thorin's hammer shattered them like brittle glass. "Enough!" Bramble screamed, and the very air around him began to darken. "You will not take this from me! The power, the mastery, the ability to make things grow beyond the dreams of simple gardeners. I will not go back to being small and weak and ordinary." But even as he spoke, young Pip was opening the seed box, and the simple treasures within began to glow with their own light. Not the harsh radiance of corruption, but the gentle warmth of honest sun on growing things. The scent of clean earth filled the air, and suddenly Bramble was weeping, his tears cutting channels through the mask of shadow that had claimed his face. "I remember," he whispered. "Oh, by the green earth, I remember what I was." Section 16, The Ring's Whisper. In the depths of his corruption, as the battle raged around his garden and his very soul hung in the balance, Bramble Greenhill felt something stir that had lain dormant for years beyond counting. Deep beneath his hobbit hole, in a chamber he had forgotten he had ever carved, something golden began to gleam with its own malevolent light. The one ring, lost for an age, had been sleeping in the darkness of Bramble's root cellar, not by chance, but by the design of forces beyond mortal comprehension. For the master of all corruption had many servants, and chief among them was the golden band that had been forged in the fires of Mount Doom to bind all things to the will of shadow. As Bramble's defences cracked under the assault of memory and love, the ring felt its opportunity. Its voice, subtle as silk and poisonous as serpent's venom, began to whisper in the halfling's mind. "Why do you hesitate?" it seemed to say, though no words were spoken aloud. "You have tasted power beyond the dreams of your simple people. You have made the earth itself bend to your will. Would you throw all that away to return to being a simple gardener, forgotten and ordinary?" Bramble's hands went to his throat, where beneath his shirt hung a chain he had worn so long he had forgotten its weight. "No," he whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. I remember who I was. I remember the joy of simple growing, the pleasure of honest work." "Joy?" The ring's mental voice was rich with mockery. "What joy is there in struggling with poor soil and uncertain weather, in watching half your crops fail and your neighbours' gardens flourish while yours struggle? I gave you mastery, little gardener. I made you great." Around him, the battle continued. Greymantle's staff blazed with white fire as he held back the writhing vines that sought to drag him into the earth. Lord Silverleaf danced between the thorns like water flowing around stones, his ancient blade singing as it cut through corruption. Young Pip clutched his seed box and called out words of love and memory, each phrase striking the corrupted halfling like a physical blow. But the ring's voice grew stronger, more insistent. They come to take everything from you. They would see you reduced to what you were before, small, weak, ordinary. Is that truly what you want? To return to failure and frustration when you could have everything your heart desires? Everything! Bramble repeated, his voice growing stronger as the ring's influence reasserted itself. Yes, I could have everything. Not just mastery over my own garden, but over all growing things. I could make the entire world bloom according to my will. His eyes blazed with renewed darkness, and the shadows around him deepened until it seemed that night itself had fallen over the greenwood. The impossible plants in his garden grew larger and more twisted, their whispered voices joining the ring's seductive chorus. But even as the corruption rallied, young Pip stepped forward, tears streaming down his face, but his voice steady and strong. "Uncle," he said, "do you remember the first thing you ever taught me about gardening?" Bramble paused, the ring's whispers faltering for just a moment. "You said," Pip continued, "that the most important thing wasn't making plants grow big or perfect or better than anyone else's. You said the most important thing was love. Love for the earth, love for growing things, and love for the people who would be fed by what we grew." The ring's voice rose to a shriek in Bramble's mind, but for the first time in years, he chose not to listen. Section 17. The Shadow Retreats. The moment of choice had come, and all creation seemed to hold its breath. Bramble Greenhill stood in the centre of his impossible garden, the ring's chain burning like fire around his neck, while the forces of light and darkness waged their final battle for his soul. Around him, the very air shimmered with power as ancient magics clashed, and the fate of all growing things hung in the balance. "Choose," Greymantle said gently, his staff held ready but not threatening. "Choose not with your mind, but with your heart. What does the deepest part of you remember? What did you love before power whispered its false promises?" Bramble's hands went to the chain around his neck, and for a moment his fingers touched the golden band that had been his secret shame and hidden strength for so long. The ring pulsed with malevolent heat, its voice a constant whisper of temptation and threat. "If you cast me aside," it hissed, "you will have nothing, no power, no mastery, no ability to make the world bend to your will. You will be ordinary again, small, forgotten, weak." But young Pip stepped closer, still clutching his box of precious seeds. "Uncle," he said softly, "look at what you've become. Look at what your garden has become. Are these the growing things you wanted to tend? Are these the flowers you dreamed of when you first put seed to soil?" Bramble looked around at his creation, at roses that bled shadow, at fruit trees that bore poison, at vines that whispered madness in the wind. For the first time in years, he truly saw what his pursuit of perfection had wrought. This was not gardening, but perversion, not growth, but corruption wearing the mask of life. "I wanted," he whispered, his voice breaking like a child's, "I wanted to make beautiful things grow. I wanted to feed people, to bring joy with flowers and plenty with good harvests. When did it become this? When did it become wrong?" The ring's voice rose to a shriek of rage and desperation. "You are nothing without me. Nothing." But Bramble was no longer listening. With trembling hands, he lifted the chain from around his neck and held the golden band before him. For the first time in an age, he saw it clearly, not as a tool of power, but as a shackle that had bound his heart to darkness. "I choose," he said, and his voice carried across the hills like a bell tolling the end of a long nightmare. "I choose to be ordinary. I choose to be small. I choose to fail sometimes and struggle often, and find joy in simple things." With a cry that shattered the unnatural silence, Bramble hurled the ring away from him. It struck the earth with a sound like thunder, and immediately the corruption that had spread from his garden began to writhe and retreat. The impossible plants withered and died, their unnatural splendour fading to reveal ordinary earth beneath. Smaug the dragon caught the ring in his great claws before it could burrow into the soil. "This bauble has caused enough harm," he rumbled, and breathed upon it with dragon fire until the golden band was nothing but slag and shadow. As the last echoes of the ring's destruction faded, Bramble Greenhill collapsed to his knees in what had once been his garden. He was himself again, small and ordinary and wonderfully, beautifully mortal. The shadow that had consumed him was gone. fled back to whatever deep place it had emerged from, wounded and diminished. "Uncle," Pip whispered, kneeling beside him. "Uncle, are you—" Bramble looked up, and in his eyes was the simple joy of a gardener who had rediscovered his love for growing things. "I am," he said softly. "I am myself again." Section 18. Hope in Ashes. Spring came early to the greenwood that year, as if the earth itself rejoiced in its freedom from corruption. Where Bramble's impossible garden had once stood, ordinary flowers now bloomed, daisies and forget-me-nots, roses without thorns, and vegetables that grew according to nature's own design, rather than dark will. Greymantle stood once more at the garden gate, but now he was not alone. Beside him, Bramble Greenhill knelt in honest dirt, his hands, smaller now, more gentle, working to plant seeds from young Pip's precious box. There was grey in the halfling's hair and lines of sorrow around his eyes, for the memory of what he'd become would never fully fade. But there was also peace, the deep contentment that comes from work done with love rather than ambition. "Will the scars ever heal completely?" Bramble asked, not looking up from his planting. Around them, the other halflings of the greenwood went about their morning tasks, no longer touched by unnatural hunger for perfection. The corruption that had threatened to spread through all the little folk had died with the destruction of the ring, leaving only the sweet ache of recovery. "Some scars are meant to remain," Greymantle replied gently. "They remind us of dangers faced and wisdom earned through suffering. But see how the earth accepts these new seeds? See how eagerly they reach toward the light? Even scarred soil can nurture new growth." In the distance, smoke rose from the chimneys of Sweetwater Village, and children's laughter carried on the morning wind. Lord Silverleaf had returned to his woodland realm, King Thorin to his mountain halls, and even Great Smaug had departed for his distant lair, though it was said that the dragon's hoard now contained treasures of a different sort. Memories of the day he chose redemption, over ruin. Young Pip came running up the hill, his face bright with excitement. Uncle, come see. The radishes in the south field are coming up and they're perfect. Not too big, not too bright, just ordinary and wonderful." Bramble smiled, and in that smile was all the joy that had been missing from his impossible garden. "Ordinary and wonderful," he repeated. "Yes, that sounds exactly right." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting gentle shadows across the healing land, Greymantle prepared to take his leave. His work here was done, though he suspected it would be remembered in songs and stories for ages to come. The tale of a halfling who nearly destroyed his home through love perverted into pride, and who found salvation through love restored to its proper place. "Where will you go now?" Bramble asked, rising from his honest labour with dirt under his fingernails and contentment in his heart. The wizard smiled, his eyes already distant with thoughts of other roads, other troubles that might need a wanderer's attention. "Where the path leads," he replied. "There are always shadows stirring somewhere in the world, always those who need reminding that even the smallest light can drive away the greatest darkness." He paused at the gate and looked back one last time at the simple garden, at the halfling who knelt among ordinary flowers, at the peaceful hills of the greenwood rolling away to the horizon. "Remember this day," he said softly. "Remember that redemption is always possible, that love can reach even into the deepest shadow, and that sometimes the most important choice is to remain beautifully, blessedly small." With that, Greymantle walked away down the old road, his grey robes stirring in the gentle wind. Behind him, in the garden that had nearly brought ruin to the world, a simple halfling tended simple plants with simple joy, and all was as it should be. The song that bound all things together rang clear and true once more, its melody sweet with the harmony of hope reborn and innocence reclaimed. In the end, that was enough. In the end, it was everything. Thus ends the chronicle of the halfling who nearly destroyed the Shire, as set down by the chroniclers of the greenwood in the days when memory was still green and hope burned bright in the hearts of the small folk. May its lesson never be forgotten, that in the choice between power and love, wisdom lies always in choosing love,